Hi, I'm so happy to be here with you too. I'm Leah Rothman. I am the host and producer and writer of the Real Killer podcast. We're in our second season now. And the second season is about the story of Keith LaMar and the Lucasville uprising that happened in 1993. It was some people call it a riot, but a lot of people call it an uprising. It lasted 11 days, and at the end of it, 10 people were killed. One corrections officer, and 9 prisoners. And, it sparked the biggest investigation in the Ohio State Highway Patrol's history. I think around 50 people were charged and convicted of crimes. 5 were sent to death row, Keith LaMar being one of them. He was charged, convicted, and sent to death row for being the leader of this, they called it a death squad. A group of people, they said he led a group of people through a part of the prison where the uprising was happening, and killed 4 guys who were considered snitches. Then he was also accused of calling for the death of another gentleman in a K block cell. So all in all, he was charged with more murders than anyone else during the uprising. And he is on death row, and he's been on death row since 1995.
When do they have a scheduled execution date for him currently, correct?
Yes, it's scheduled for November 16th of this year, 2023. Keith says he's innocent. He absolutely did not commit any of those murders. He didn't call for the murders. He says when he's guilty, he says he's guilty. He was in prison already for murder. He says that it was basically like a robbery that happened in an apartment where drugs were being dealt, where he was dealing drugs. And a shootout happened, and he shot and killed this young man named Kenyatta Collins. And Keith was shot twice as well. But he says he says that he admitted guilt. And he was sentenced 18 to life for that. So Keith says when he's guilty, he says he's guilty. It'd be very easy for him to say that he committed these 5 crimes because he had been offered an amazing plea deal, but he couldn't. There's no way he could have lived with himself to admit to doing something that he knew he didn't do.
No. And it wouldn't have been considered self-defense, considering he got shot himself. Is that a thing there in Ohio?
The way he describes that is, it was a place where illegal activity was happening, and he didn't really have a defense to say it was self-defense. He says you can't do a stand your ground in a drug den.
Okay.
So, he said he could not claim self-defense. So he pled guilty.
Oh.
And unfortunately, sorry to interrupt you. Unfortunately, the young man who was shot, Kenyatta Collins, was an old friend of his, a childhood friend of his.
Oh.
So they used to walk to school together. They knew each other. I think kind of had gone their separate ways, but they were still in and around the same group of people. So it wasn't a close friend, but it was a friend, which is very sad.
Yes.
It just adds on to the guilt that he's going to have to live with forever.
Yeah. I think at the time I asked him about it, and I said, how did you feel when you realized you had shot and killed your childhood friend? And, he said at the time, I think I rationalized it because I had to. It's like, well, I felt that I was under fire, so I did what I had to do. And I think he just describes it as that's how I had to cope back then.
Yeah. Yeah. Honestly, that would be the best for his. So he was in prison for this murder when this riot or what did you call it? Uprising?
Uprising
occurred. Was he getting close to his release date? Because, 18 years, he was still in there for quite a bit of time after. For the original crime.
Yeah. He went into prison in 1989, and he was first sent to this place called Lebanon Correctional Facility. He unfortunately got caught up. The way he describes it is like there were these two big factions at Lebanon. Now I can't remember if it was Dayton and Toledo, but there were a group of guys that were not from Cleveland, and he and his friends were from Cleveland, and it wasn't good, right? They were fighting with each other and had beef with each other. And he was told that one of the other guys had threatened the life of one of his friends. And so, in prison, the way I understand it, that stuff can't go unanswered. Mm-hmm. So a big fight broke out. When it was all said and done, Keith and a lot of the guys from Cleveland were sent to Lucasville. Okay. Turns out Keith's friend's life had never been threatened. So that fight never needed to happen. He never needed to be transferred to Lucasville. And, the rest is like, didn't have to happen.
Yeah. It's definitely like butterfly effect.
Yeah. Yeah, definitely.
From the little I know about the uprising, it started off of the facility demanding tuberculosis testing, correct?
Yes. I mean, a lot of people talk about all the things that had been going on in Lucasville for years. It was where they sent the quote unquote worst of the worst. It was a really difficult environment. It was mostly staffed by white Southern corrections officers, and the majority of the prisoners were Black from urban areas of Ohio. So there was a lot of racism. There's a lot of alleged racism, I should say. A lot of people talk about the racism that happened there. They talked about guards bringing in knives for the white guys. And, again, this is what I was told, but there were a lot of issues at Lucasville prior to the uprising. There was a woman, Beverly Taylor, who had been murdered a few years before. And after that happened, they brought in a new warden, Arthur Tate. And, he was tasked with it was an impossible task to try to bring some order to a place that was in complete disorder. Mm-hmm. So he started this thing called Operation Shakedown. And, he's like, the biggest thing was violence. I'd never seen that level of violence before. So, he took away college classes, and everything was very restricted once Operation Shakedown was instituted. And so there were all these things leading up to the tuberculosis testing. Then there was the TB testing, and there were 159 guys who had said they didn't want the testing. 40 something, I think, were Sunni Muslim prisoners. And they believed that the test contained a form of alcohol, and in consuming any sort of alcohol was against their religion. And so being forced to take this test was a violation of their rights. And, they had said, look, there are other ways you can test us. We're not against being tested. Just don't test us this way. And, Arthur Tate was like, hey, you're not going to tell me how to run my prison. And it's going to happen one way or another. So he had planned for the prison to be locked down for 3 days, Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday after Easter Sunday. And, but the Sunni Muslim community said, we're going to do something before that. So the whole thing kicked off on Easter Sunday.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
So there's a lot going on. Oh,
there's a lot. Yeah.
Huh.
Wow.
Sorry.
This is in 1993, which is the same time that Waco was happening. So the media coverage of this event, what kind of happened with that? Give us kind of a little bit of info on what happened there.
Yeah, I mean, Waco obviously was huge, right? Mm-hmm. But this was pretty big too. I mean, this is the second largest and let me get this right. It was the second longest and deadliest prison riot in U.S. history to date. So it was getting a lot of attention. I mean, I interviewed Bob Orr, who was an anchor at the station where I was an intern, and he describes it as like, you know, he moved on to CBS National News, and he was like, this was as big as any of the national stories that I'd ever covered before. So it was a huge, huge story. Second, I think, to Waco, but it was still huge. I mean, there was like international media there. I mean, they had a whole place where they put the press, this place called Media Hill. It was a huge, huge story.
Are you from this area?
Yeah, I'm from Chicago originally, but I went to junior high school, and college in Ohio. And I was a senior at Ohio State studying broadcast journalism, interning at the local CBS station when the riot happened. And so I begged them, you know, I thought I was going to be this like war correspondent. I was like going to be this hard news lady. And I was like, I got to get down there. I got to get, you know, not having any sort of sense of what was going on. It was just like the biggest thing that happened in Ohio, and, you know, the biggest thing was just the biggest thing. So they basically said, you can go, you can't get out of the van. You know, have to come right back. We're just dropping off, I think, some supplies. But it was crazy to be there. And so when I heard about Keith's story, at first I was like, wait a minute, why does that sound familiar? I had totally blocked it out. It was like a moment, right? You know, when I was like so young, and I was like, wait a minute, this sounds really familiar. Wait a minute, I was there for a second, you know? So, yeah.
Oh, wow. So it wasn't until later on that you heard about Keith's case and how did you decide to get involved with Keith? Like, how did this come to be?
Well, you know, we're on I was looking for a story for the second season of the podcast. And there was a story that we were thinking about doing. This gentleman named Christopher Dunn out of Missouri. We were thinking about doing his case, but it wasn't exactly going to work for us, which feels really weird to say, to like deduce someone's case in life and story while they're sitting in prison down to like the story for me. But I very much connected with his wife and wanted to try to do something to help. So I reached out to the senior producer at Jason Flom's Wrongful Conviction podcast. We had talked a little bit over the course of the first season. And he was like, that sounds great. We would totally be interested. And by the way, there's a story that's too big for us. Would you be interested? So that's how I learned about Keith and the case.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
We totally get you about like picking and choosing which cases to cover. It's the most difficult thing, but you have to have like enough information. And we talk about this all the time. So totally. And we are episodic. So we only need 30 minutes to an hour.
Much less information than you need.
Right.
And it's still very difficult.
Yeah. And I would have loved to have done Christopher's case, story, but you understand. Unfortunately, it didn't work. And I want them to get all the press and, stuff possible. You guys should look into his case.
Yes.
Say it for me one more time so I can write it down.
Christopher Dunn, Dunn.
Christopher.
And I'm a little fuzzy on the details right now because it's been a minute. I kind of am the person who it's like you cram for a test and you know everything. And then as soon as you don't need to know it, it's gone. So
that's me.
So some of the details are fuzzy on Christopher's case, but he is sitting in prison. I believe a court has said he is innocent, but they are not releasing him. And Missouri is, Missouri's a bit of a hot mess. I don't know if you're familiar with the LaMar Johnson case. They just let him out of prison. And Kevin Strickland was let out, I believe, last year. And I think it was the ACLU who said, free Kevin Strickland, free LaMar Johnson, free Christopher Dunn. Yeah. So he is, but there's a precedent in Ohio that's based on Rodney Lincoln, who was in our first season, that basically, unless you're on death row, actual innocence is not good enough. So you might be innocent, but if you're not on death row,
then it's fine.
Yeah, as Rodney's attorney Trisha Bushnell said, too bad, so sad. Good luck. So
that's insane.
Yeah.
So you said you went to college for journalism. What were you always interested in, like the true crime space, or did that kind of evolve over the years?
Yeah, no, it definitely evolved. I went to New York after graduating from college and worked for Barbara Walters, and worked on some, I don't even know if it's around anymore. Is A&E Biography around anymore?
No, but I know what it is.
I know what it is. I was like, is it not? Because
I'm old enough to know what it is.
That was a big deal back in the day. That was like a big
It was.
I was only a PA, but so I worked on a bunch of different kinds of shows. I worked on a show called Sex Box, where it was a British show originally, but people who were having relationship problems would go into a box on stage with the live studio audience, and they would have sex and then come out and talk about their relationship. You talk about it before, they would go and do it, then they would come out and talk about it again with therapists.
Oh, that's not at all what I was thinking. I don't know why. Based on the name, I should know.
The show got canceled. I think a bunch of like family conservative groups are like, get this thing off the air. But
oh my god!
So I worked on a lot of different shows.
I feel like it'd be a great show for Netflix now. Isn't there several of those types of shows on Netflix now?
Yeah, I think times have evolved. I think this was back, I want to say it was around maybe 2007, maybe 2008, somewhere around there.
So it's just a little early for its time.
Yeah,
now it'd be fine.
Yeah, a little early for Sex in a Box. But
yeah.
So, yeah, I mean, I ended up working at Crime Watch Daily for 3 years, the full run. And I think that's really where, obviously, it was true crime all the time. And yeah, I think that was where it started.
Okay.
And I was a mass communications major in college. So when you get put into these media style jobs, most of what you are covering or hearing about is crime, because that's what the media puts in. When you're a PA on the news, all you're talking about is negative things. It's very rarely positive stories. So you kind of get immersed into the true crime genre against your will, and then it just kind of becomes what you do.
Right. And it's definitely over the last decade, at least, I mean, people, it's weird to say it, but people are just so interested. And I think we're all investigators at heart. We kind of want to know and, find out what happened, whether it's injustice or an unsolved crime. I think a lot of us are just naturally inquisitive people. And, yeah. And then somewhere along the way, true crime on its own just became a thing. I mean,
sure.
A whole industry on its own. There you go, which is insane.
It's insane.
So tell us a little bit about the process of meeting with Keith and being able to establish a relationship to tell his story. Because a lot of people ask us, how do you reach out to these individuals, and how do you create that connection and respect to be able to develop a working partnership? Because that's what it is.
Yeah, I have never had such a long relationship with someone whose story I'm telling. I mean, the first season was like a 5-year journey for me, but it wasn't a constant, every week or a couple of times a week interviewing them. So I reached out, to Keith's advocate and asked if they would be open to talking with me. And they had already been talking with the Jason Flom team. So, they are obviously looking for some media attention. And, I, at this point, I think I've interviewed Keith, I want to say 27, maybe 28 times. And, for hours and hours and hours and hours. And I don't know. I mean, I found a connection to him. I think, it's my job to find a connection, and I genuinely find a connection to the people I'm talking with.
Mm-hmm.
I also feel like, and I'm sure you do too, that you're deeply empathetic. And I think about, like, if I were in the person's shoes, how would I want to be talked to? How would I want to be questioned? How I want to be like treated? So I think very early on, there was a connection there, and he felt open to talking. And, I mean, wasn't a slow build, but, it took a minute for us to like be comfortable with each other. And I don't remember how many interviews in we were when I went to go visit him, but I think that also really sort of solidified our, connection, being able to see each other in person. And, it's one thing to do it over the computer or the phone, but to be able to like see the person and like shake their hand. And, so yeah, I don't know if I answered your question, but
I go ahead.
I believe that the in-person meeting, being willing to put yourself out there, take the time out of your day to travel to this location, to take the time to meet with them and do all of the steps it takes to get into a prison, because it's not just, hey, you show up at the door and get to visit. You have to submit paperwork. You have to be on a list. It's a long process to be able to have that in-person meeting, and building the rapport and the respect of taking time out of your everyday life to be willing to do that. I think that's important and commendable to a lot of people that do this.
Thank you. I mean, I've never told the story of someone who's on death row. I mean, I think that the gravity of this, and Keith says he's innocent and that he didn't get a fair trial. I'm here to ask the questions and to see what I learn. But it does, the weight of this did not like go over my head. Like, he's on death row. He has an execution date. And I mean, most stories don't take this long, but we're now like 10, 11 months into telling Keith's story. There's no way to, I don't know, cut corners, or there's no way to do it faster. Like, it took the time it needed to take. And his story is still ongoing. So, it's, yeah.
Gosh, I just can't imagine, because there is a time clock, essentially.
Give us a little bit more information. Obviously, we're going to send everyone to your podcast to get the full details, but give us a little bit about the actual uprising, and if you can kind of paint a little bit of a picture of what was happening in there based on what Keith has told you.
Well, what's interesting about Keith is that he says he wasn't in there. So this is what Keith says happened. Keith says he's out on the rec yard. The uprising, unbeknownst to him, is kicking off inside. He says that he lines up. There's like a bell that goes off. They line up because they're about to go inside, and he sees a guard running out with blood streaming down his head. And that is what he says was the first indicator that there was anything going on inside. And, he's like, look, when something like that happens, the troops like circle, stuff's about to happen. We're about to be swarmed by, corrections officers, and this thing, whatever it was, is going to end soon. And he says that doesn't happen. And, then people are talking, and they're like, there's, an uprising going on inside. And so Keith says that he wanted to go inside and check on his belongings. And so eventually he and a couple of other guys go inside. And when he gets to his cell, there's a guy locked in his cell. And, to him, he says, aha, I knew someone was going to be stealing my stuff. Like, what are you doing in my cell? So he says that he goes to the control panel where you can open all the cell doors, and he starts opening all the cell doors to try to get inside his. He says at that point, someone from the Muslim community he's like seemingly in charge at that point, comes over and like says, what are you doing? And he says, I'm trying to get, what's going on in my cell? Like, I want to make sure my stuff isn't stolen. And the guy basically says, according to Keith, look, you can either stay inside and be part of this, or you got to leave. And he's like, I don't want to be part of this. So he goes back out to the rec yard. Keith says that he is out on the rec yard, and there are like 300 guys that are out there. Around 2 o'clock in the morning, they're all rounded up and taken into K Block, where first in the gymnasium, where they're stripped naked, searched, and then put in cells in K Block, some up to 10 per cell. Oh. And it's a cell meant for one person, and they had 10 naked men in one cell.
Oh.
Yeah.
That's going to cause some issues right there.
Yeah, you think, right? It's like, and then Keith says that at some point they come around and they give them white jumpsuits and they throw sandwiches at them. And there's a mad scramble for sandwiches. He says that a couple of the guys get into a fight in the cell, in this K Block cell, and it ends up leading to this gentleman, Dennis Weaver, being murdered in that cell. And Keith says he deeply regrets that he didn't do anything to stop it. But when you're in prison, you put your head down, you don't do it, you just put your head down and you don't say anything. So Keith says he witnessed the murder of Dennis Weaver and didn't do anything. He says he had nothing to do with the killings in L Block of the snitches, the so-called snitches, because he wasn't there. He said he went in to check on his belongings. He went back out to the yard, wasn't there for it. So that's what Keith says happened. The investigators and prosecutors believe something else. They believe that he came in and, which is always really interesting to me, because a guy named Lewis Jones, who testifies against Keith at trial, says that they went inside to check on their belongings. Keith saw what was going on and then said, "Hey, I wonder if we kill these snitches, if they'll let us go, if they'll let us leave." And it doesn't make a whole lot of sense because, and I'm sorry, I'm sort of telling this out of order, but
it's fine.
The snitches had been put in cells for safekeeping. So the Muslim prisoners had put these so-called snitches away so that they wouldn't be killed. So this guy, Lewis Jones, testifies that Keith goes inside, they go inside, and Keith's like, "Hey, I wonder if we kill these snitches, if they'll let us leave." And it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense, because why would you be allowed to kill the people that have been put away for safekeeping, number one? Yeah. And like Keith says, why would they let me kill a bunch of people and then let me leave so that they're left holding the bag?
Yeah.
Why would they? At some point, he says, at some point this thing's going to end and someone's going to get in trouble. Why would they let me leave? So that is sort of what is surrounding Keith during the uprising. The uprising, as it seems, reportedly, the Sunni Muslims kicked off this uprising because of the TB testing, and very quickly 2 other groups join, sort of in solidarity against the administration: the Black Gangster Disciples and the Aryan Brotherhood. Oh. So you've got 3 groups that are really not friends, Yeah. Mm-hmm. But they come together and they make this them against the administration. And the administration cuts off water and power early on. And, the prisoners inside, write on bed sheets, and they want access to the media. It's one of the biggest things that they were asking for. They wanted transparency. Okay. And the people in charge were not wanting to give that to them. So
that seems like a very doable request in my mind.
Mm-hmm. Me too.
Yep.
I mean, I don't know anything about negotiations like that, but it seems like that seemed doable.
Yes.
I mean, in the movies, don't they say I feel like they've got people who are asking for things and they're like, "I want a plane full of fuel and I want $10 million. Like, nobody was asking for that. They just want to be able to talk to the press.
Yeah. Yeah. And not saying that we couldn't even stop the press from putting that out there, because that happens. So just let them talk and get the word out and calm the situation down.
Right.
And then obviously work.
De-escalate.
Exactly. De-escalate. Right. So what happened after the 11 days of this whole situation? They got everyone under control, but did they start making changes? And I really hope the Sunni Muslims did not have to do the TB test, but I'm probably incorrect about that.
That is a very good question. I do not know what came of the TB testing.
Whatever happened. No.
Whatever happened. I think so this guy named Nikki Schwartz was a prisoner rights lawyer from Cleveland. He came in and helped negotiate the end of the uprising.
Okay.
In the course of it at day 5, Officer Robert Vallandigham was killed. And that, I think, changed the course of the next several days.
Mm-hmm.
And so there was access to the press. There were more negotiations. They had released 2 more guards at that point. So unfortunately, things changed once the officer, Officer Vallandigham was killed. So day 11, Nikki Schwartz helps negotiate the end. As part of the negotiation, the prisoners were, they asked to not stay at Lucasville. They asked to be transferred to other prisons because they were just afraid of the retaliation.
Yes.
So, and in my research, I sort of stopped with like what happened after the uprising and then started focusing on Keith and his case.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
And there's something I'd like to tell you, but I can't say it yet. So there's more coming. Okay. There's more insight into what happened during the uprising in a later episode.
Okay.
And I'd like to say more, but I can't.
Looking forward to that episode. So the legal process, now that you're shifting into Keith's case with the uprising ending, or they're coming to an agreement, whatever happened with that. Now Keith is essentially being retried for what happened here. Or not retried, excuse me. That's the wrong phrase. He is now being put on trial for these issues.
Right. So he was indicted in 1994. His trial took place in 95. They asked for a change. His attorneys asked for a change of venue because, the Lucasville area was very prejudiced. They moved it to like basically the next county over, which was still very close to Lucasville. And, Keith says was not fair. He had an all-white jury. 2 black jurors had been released. He says that the state put on kind of an impressive and cohesive story. It was very buttoned up. They had several prisoners. First of all, basically everyone, any of the prisoner witnesses got some sort of deal. So there was some incentive. It seems like there was some incentive. There was no physical evidence tying him or any of the guys in any of the cases to any of the crimes. So there was roughly 22,000 pieces of physical evidence, and none of them could be tied to anyone, including the 5 guys who were on death row or any of the other guys.
Oh, wow.
So all the prosecution had were these witnesses, these prisoner witnesses who had gotten some sort of deal to talk. So there were, I think, 5 guys who testified about what happened in L Block. And I think 2 or 3 guys who testified about what happened in that K Block cell. And when it was all said and done, he was convicted. And so I should back up, because one of the biggest issues, according to Keith's defense team, was that they weren't given a lot of exculpatory evidence. And so, I mean, I read the 4,000 pages of trial transcripts, and and in a lot of the pretrial transcripts, there were the defense team was constantly asking, we know there's exculpatory, like we need, please hand over what you have. We we believe that there's more exculpatory evidence. You're not handing it over. And the judge, I mean, it's in the trial transcripts. The judge would say to the prosecution, hey, do your best. I know it's a lot to go through, but do your best to give them what they're asking for. And the prosecutors would say, okay, we'll do our best. So the investigation, sorry, there's just so much to this. The investigation conducted by the Ohio State Highway Patrol resulted in like roughly 1,300 interviews with
Oh, wow.
prisoners. Some were interviewed once, twice. Some people were interviewed 11 and 12 times. So I'd never heard of that before, that many interviews. But the defense was not given all of that. They were often just given summaries of statements. So they didn't even know what they didn't have. You know, they didn't know. Yeah.
Which is, I thought it was a law that they have to give them all the evidence that they're showing.
It's a Brady violation.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I think there might have been some loophole in Ohio back then.
Oh.
That although some people are like, well, there's no loophole to a federal like case like Brady.
Yeah.
There was, according to the prosecutors, and they were quoted in the New York Times. They haven't spoken with me yet, but they were quoted in the New York Times saying that they handed over everything that they were legally bound to hand over. So, and you know, one of Keith's defense attorneys, Bob Toy, was a former prosecutor, and he said, look, we could get away with not giving much to defense teams. So, you know, he was on both sides of it, and he could see, he was like, I used to do that too. I wouldn't necessarily turn over everything that I needed to turn over. So at one point there, and this is all in the pre-trial stuff before you even get to the trial, there's a list of 43 names of prisoners and 11 pages, bless you, and 11 pages of statement summaries. And the prosecutor said, we can't match up the statements with the names because we promised these guys anonymity. And so they read some of the stuff in court, but they didn't say who said what. So the judge said to Keith's defense team, good luck. Go off and try to figure out who said what. And, you know, Keith's defense attorneys were like, you know, it was a fool's errand. Like there was no way, with the time and money and resources we had, there was no way to figure out who said what. So a big part of Keith's case is that he believes, and his attorneys believe, that there was a lot of exculpatory evidence that was not handed over, that's come to light in the years that have followed. Interestingly enough, some of those names and statements were matched up for 2 trials that followed Keith's. So it's like, well, wait a minute. Why will you do that now and not?
Yeah.
So there seems to have been a lot of problems with Keith's trial.
Wow. So it was him and a couple others that were convicted of all these murders, correct? It wasn't just Keith?
Keith was convicted of killing 5 guys, 4 in L block and 1 in K block. There were other guys who were part of this so-called death squad, but they were not given the death penalty. So, and I'm not clear. There have been very different numbers in terms of how many people made up this alleged death squad. Some said 4, some said 5, some said up to 8. So, but no, there are 5 guys who are on death row. Keith is on death row for killing, I don't mean to say just prisoners, but prisoners. The 4 other guys were charged with and convicted of crimes having to do with a couple of prisoners and the death of the Officer Robert Vallandigham.
Okay. Does this include the Muslims that initially started the whole uprising?
Yes. There are 2 from the Muslim community on death row. There are 2 from the Aryan Brotherhood who are on death row. And then there's Keith. Interestingly enough, there's no one from the Black Gangster Disciples who's on death row.
Interesting.
Very interesting.
Very interesting.
And all the evidence that they have is he said, she said statements, essentially, because they never found DNA or actual forensic evidence in this
correct
uprising, in these murders. All
they have is what they call snitch testimony, prisoner or witness testimony. And, you know, I mean, Keith says it, and I said it before, it's like they had a pretty tight case. You know, he's like, my defense consisted of like, I don't know what happened in L block because I wasn't there. And, yes, I was there for K Block. I did not have anything to do with the death of Dennis Weaver. You're right. I didn't do anything. And he told guys, like, don't talk to them, like and he believes that's why he was targeted, was because he was very vocal about not wanting to cooperate with the authorities.
Probably because he was thinking that this might happen to him. So,
Right.
Wow.
Yeah. And I think he says it, he believed in our criminal justice system. He believed that he would be able to get a fair trial and that truth would prevail. And, he's on death row.
And now we have seen that it doesn't.
Right. Time and time again.
Wow. And it's definitely getting close to that time. Is there any call to action? Is there a petition? I was like, what a sign-up sheet I was about to say. Not a sign-up sheet. Petition. What, besides just getting the word out about Keith's case, his story, what can listeners do to help?
I think the best thing they can do is his advocates have a website. It's Keith LaMar. Wait, what is it? Hold on a second. I think it's just
KeithLaMar.org.
KeithLaMar.org. Yes, it's KeithLaMar.org. And then there's a Facebook group that's called Justice for Keith LaMar. Okay. I think those are two places if people want to go and learn more about his case, in addition to listening to the podcast.
Of course.
But no, I think, everything that his advocates are doing can be found in those two places. And if people are interested and want to do something, and they've had change.org petitions before. I'm not sure what the state of that is right now, but I think if people want to get involved, then the Justice for Keith LaMar Facebook group and KeithLaMar.org website.
Obviously, this is a serialized podcast. You got to start at number 1 or you're going to be lost in this whole conversation. Start at episode 1. Make sure you subscribe. Make sure you follow on all of your social medias, which I think I found them all this morning. So we will include all of them in our episode as well. Sign the petition if you feel inclined. Go to those websites, like Leah said. What else can we do for you?
That's a really good question. How long do you have? No, I'm kidding. No, I mean, I think, I wish I had started the Instagram account for the first season. I think we had a Flickr account where we put up like 5 photos or 7 photos. Flickr still makes me laugh. But I think because there are so many names and there are so many people and so many characters, and I hate to deduce it down to characters, but having the visual of seeing like what Keith's defense attorneys looked like and, what Keith looked like through the years. And I put up some court documents and some excerpts from the trial transcripts. Like, I think it helps as like a companion piece to the podcast. So, I think it helps. I think it helps because I'm a visual person. And it helps me to see, it helps me. So,
and I think it humanizes Keith. He's not just this prisoner right now. He's a human being. He had a life, and like you said, it was different things that happened periodically that led him to where he is now, out of no control of his own. Like, it was completely out of his control. So, I think pictures and people absolutely love all of that. And I think it definitely helps the case as well.
Yeah. And, one of the reasons I wanted to tell this story was because I think a lot of times people who are already in prison are written off. It's like, well, why should I care about that person? They've already done a bunch of bad things or done something bad. And basically whatever is coming to them, they deserve. And that should not be the case. And, there are a lot of Keith LaMars who are in prison who don't have strong advocates or don't have a way to get their story out. And I think yeah, it was important for me to tell his story for many reasons, but also because I think it kind of goes to the prisoners who were killed during the uprising. I mean, I'm actually kind of upset with myself that I don't have any photos of them prior to their mugshots or their booking photos, because to reduce those people who are victims to just their prison shots doesn't do them justice. Like they deserve better than that. So I think, in a lot of the podcast, Keith talks about what prison life is actually like. And, we can imagine it. We can watch it in movies. I've never learned so much from someone with firsthand knowledge of the horrors. And I'm going off into a bunch of different places, but basically I think we need to start thinking about the people who are in prison as human beings. And,
exactly.
Yeah.
And they're victims too. They're victims too.
Absolutely.
And just showing their mugshot already is giving into the human bias. Like we're already being like, oh yeah, well, he's obviously in prison. And that is going to obviously, make some people think a certain way without even getting the full story about the human they were or they are. So.
Totally. Like some of the pictures that I've included on social media, which probably shouldn't have used, but whatever. They would have, so it's like their mugshot and then their name, and then the newspaper would put in what they were in prison for. And it was the announcement of them being victims. They had been murdered.
Exactly.
And they still felt the need to put like aggravated robbery or rape or whatever it was that they were in prison for. And I'm like, nope, cutting that because it doesn't matter. It's bad enough that I'm showing this kind of photo of them as a victim. I'm not going to like play into, the bias of
exactly.
Yeah.
And we find that with, sex workers or any type of, drug dealer, anything that anyone has a stigma around, they're just like, oh, just write them off. Even if they were murdered, it's like, oh, they're not the perfect victim. So we're not going to give them that attention.
Right. Absolutely.
It's such
it's infuriating.
clickbaity thing of the convicted murderer murdered in prison. Like that's the headline that they put instead of Jim Brown or whatever name you want to use. John Doe. That's the word I'm going to use. The name I'm going to use. John Doe murdered in prison. Why are we not? We know a Jim Brown, so I probably shouldn't use that name.
I was like, oh crap.
I was just trying to think of the common names. John Smith is what I was trying to go for, but my brain wasn't there. Instead of using their name, their history is their identifier, and that's not fair to them.
Yeah. No, it's not fair. And in one of the episodes, I ask a former prisoner at Lucasville, like I've heard, because as I started this process, I heard people called like inmates, prisoners, residents, every word. And I was like, what is how should I refer?
Yes.
And he said human beings. He's like, I don't like any of those. Yeah.
So, I would have cried. And I'm not a cry. That would make me have all the feels because you're right. Like, why are we not just calling them humans? Like,
yeah.
Oh.
I've listened to, I believe I'm on the 3rd episode of season 2 now. I kind of all back to back, so they all kind of blend together for me. I think that it is very well produced. It is a beautiful product that you have put together, and it's, I really, and not to say enjoy it, but I do enjoy it.
No, it's good.
I think it's your storytelling is just amazing.
Thank you so much. That's so kind. Thank you. That's all I know. I'm so much better at asking questions and talking. So,
oh, same girl. Same.
Yeah. Yes.
I would like to interview you two. Can we do that instead?
Yeah.
Yes.
Next time.
We're a little all over the place.
We are very much all over the place.
I mean,
it works for us, but yes.
But thank you for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being an advocate for these people. We are very much in the advocacy world of the ethical side of true crime. There's a shift coming, and thank you for being a part of it, for putting out a good product, a empathetic product, and showing that, because that's the way this is supposed to be.
Thank you so much. I think it's what the people in our stories deserve. So